Good afternoon. I'm Sue Elliott, the Chief Audience Officer for Norman Rockwell Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's illustrated talk by Harold Holzer. Today's talk marks an exciting weekend here at the museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, with the opening of Lincoln Memorial Illustrated, a celebratory collaboration with Chesterwood, the home of Daniel Chester French, and our exhibition, Lincoln Memorial Illustrated, open now through September 4th, 2022. I'm thrilled to be joined by Harold this afternoon, who will explore the memorial at 100 and the life of Daniel Chester French. Harold is the author of the award-winning Monument Man, The Life and Art of Daniel Chester French, and among his other accolades, winner of the 2015 Gilder-Lehrman Lincoln Prize, former chair of the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and co-chair of the Lincoln Forum. I'm grateful that you've joined us this afternoon. We welcome all of your questions, which we'll get to at the end of Harold's illustrated talk. And to submit those questions, if you would be so kind as to use the Q&A function in this webinar. Depending on your computer, that might be at the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen, but feel free to enter them at any time. And with that, thank you again for joining us. Harold, over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you, even though kind of sad to be virtual today. I look forward to seeing the exhibition later this month. And I certainly want to thank all of my friends at the Rockwell, especially Lori Moffat, and at Chesterwood, Donna Hassler, Dana Pilson, and Margaret Sharon, and all of those who have been so helpful to me as I have gotten so deeply into the subject of Daniel Chester French and the Lincoln Memorial, whose 100th anniversary is coming up at the end of this month. In fact, there will be an event in Washington on May 22nd, sort of a recreation of the dedication with some new remarks. And I hope to be there for that. So I do, as Sue said, have an illustrated talk to share with you, a lot of images, so I'll get to them quickly. And of course, this first one, Daniel Chester French posing with kind of an imagined model of his Lincoln Memorial head. And let's just stick with that for a minute. And this was done in 1925 by his friend, John Johansson. But skipping ahead or behind or backward, as the case may be, yes, this is Dan French in 1853 at the age of 3, a smile being coaxed out of him by a photographer, which was a difficult thing in those days because you had to pose for so long and exposure. Supposedly there was a bird in a cage that the photographer used for his child models. Well, as he got on in age, Dan was an outdoorsman. He was a bird collector. He was an unsuccessful student, I would say, at MIT. And his father was only willing to release him from school if an art teacher convinced him that he actually had the talent to become a professional. May Alcott, who you see at left, actually the inspiration for her sister's book. She was Amy in Little Women. May was his first art teacher. John Quincy Adams Ward, who you see in the middle, was a sculpting teacher in New York. And William Rimmer was an art teacher in Boston. Didn't have a lot of training, but these are the 3 early teachers. And out of that product comes matchmaking. He was 17 when he did this. It was actually wildly successful. He just sold the rights to it too quickly. When he was an older fellow, he used to see copies of this in storefronts in London and complain to whoever would listen that he had never gotten enough money out of this production. Here's Dan at the age of 21 with that great head of hair, which he will lose soon enough. He gets a commission. Speaking about centennials, it was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Concord. And the town fathers in Concord gave him the coveted commission with no experience to do what became his first national icon. Dedicated on April 19th, 1875, the Minuteman. And here's an early group of visitors. And you know the poem that accompanied it, by the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. It was a hugely successful icon, reproduced many times. But Dan was not there for the opening ceremony. General Grant, well, President Grant was there. Ralph Waldo Emerson was there. French's father was there. Dan was here in Florence, studying art. I think he was kind of too nervous to go back to Massachusetts for the opening. Instead, he studied with two sculptors there, Hiram Powers on the left and Thomas Ball on the right. In Thomas Ball's studio in Florence, he would have seen the model for this now controversial statue called the Emancipation Group, which shows Lincoln extending his arm either to a kneeling slave or a rising free person, depending on your attitude. And I say controversial because there have been calls for it to be removed. A copy has been removed in Boston, but the original still stands in Washington. And again, French, kind of the bohemian at this point, would have seen that every day of his working life in Florence. Here he is posing in his Italian expat artist look. While in Florence, he did one major work, The Awakening of Endymion, the slumbering shepherd of Greek myth. It actually did not sell. It ended up in a garden somewhere before it was rescued. So although he loved the experience in Florence, he fell in love with the sculptor's daughter, who was rejected, but he had a wonderful time. He learned a lot. And when he goes back to Boston in 1876, in the throes of a big patriotic upturn, it's speaking of centennials again, it's the centennial of the United States. And he's in for a surprise because when his ship approaches Boston Harbor, a boat comes out to meet the ship, a mail boat, and that's MAIL, of course. And he's paged to go to the gangway and meet the ship. He has no idea what it's about. It seems that as he was heading home, his father was appointed in the final days of the Grant administration as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He has command of the ship, and there is Judge French, the father, in a sculpture by his son. And the judge entices Dan to join him in Washington, D.C. He says, I'll get you all sorts of great commissions there and really launch your American career. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of great commissions to be had. He did a few, but most of his work, and here you see him at that work, was kind of dull groups that would go on the pediments of public buildings. And his father got him the work because he was organizing the construction of the buildings. This one is for the Boston Post Office. It's called Labor Sustaining Art. And it's certainly a very professional job, but it didn't really thrill the young sculptor. So he headed back to Concord, and there he got an amazing idea to do a bust from life of the town's most famous citizen, Emerson, who said when this was being done, this is exactly how I look when I shave. It was an enormous success. Again, copies, reproductions, and he was really launched now. This is 1879. He's 29 years old, and he's off to a really major career. But what would his specialty be? Well, at first, he developed a kind of an interesting specialty: college presidents or college statues. Here he is on the landing of his new New York studio in Greenwich Village, looking at the model for a portrait of Gallaudet, the inspiration for Gallaudet College for the hearing impaired in Washington. Here it is as it looks today on the campus. He also did a really well-received statue of John Harvard. It's now in Harvard Yard. This is in front of Memorial Hall in its original incarnation. And he did Alma Mater for Columbia, a statue that has been under siege a couple of times. It was actually nearly struck by a baseball hit by a member of the Columbia University team in about 1912. The ball was hit out of the park, which was close to where this statue was. And if you think you know who the baseball player was, I wish I could see you in the room because someone always knows. It was Lou Gehrig, who was then a Columbia student. This statue was actually detonated with a bomb in 1968 during the Columbia student protests, but the bomb only damaged the chair, and it has since been restored. It was taken away by the college president and then restored. So that's one specialty. He also, like many sculptors of his age, devoted himself to the Civil War. And he got lots of interesting commissions. General Grant for Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, General Joe Hooker for Boston outside the State House. And he got the taste of what really big opening ceremonies would be for these public statues. This is the Hooker unveiling in 1903 in Boston. So he got used to these events. And on another Civil War front, did this extraordinary symbolic statue. Here he is at work on it, to the Melvin brothers, all of whom had, or three of whom had died in the war. He made this astonishing model, and this is the way it looks at the memorial at the Concord Cemetery in Massachusetts. Really a great work. It's known as Morning Victory today. He also did a sculptural tribute to one of his colleagues, whom he didn't much like, but he did it anyway, named Martin Millmore, for the Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain. This is called Death Stays the Hand of the Sculptor, and you see the symbol of death actually interrupting the sculptor at work on a sphinx. This went on display at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 and was quite well received. But what French did that really emerged at the World Columbian Exposition is this massive statue of Columbia. It was meant to rival the Statue of Liberty, but like a lot of things in Chicago, including the whole World's Fair, it burned up in a fire. There is a reproduction of it in the spot where the Obama Library is going to rise soon, but there are those in Chicago who are calling for its removal. In this case, I have no idea why, but there you go. Now, this is a breakthrough moment because this sculpture really gets him enormous publicity and attention and some wealth. And like his friend Augustus St. Gaudens, friend and rival, he decides the time is right for him to get a country home where he can work during the summers. And this is when, for all of you watching from the Berkshires, this is when he moves to the Warner farmhouse in the Glendale section of Stockbridge, purchased in 1895, and then commissions Henry Bacon, who was the young architect of the World's Columbian Exposition, to build him a somewhat grander house. And there, of course, you will all recognize Chesterwood as it looked in the early part of the 20th century. No doubt this is why French used to say, I live half my year in New York and the other half in heaven. And by that, he meant the Berkshires. Bacon also designed his wonderful studio, which of course you can still visit. Here it is in 1903. And there, French worked on his first international commission, an equestrian statue of George Washington meant for Paris. And he was there again July 3rd, 1900, with the Sousa Band, the actual John Philip Sousa band with Sousa leading, playing the ceremonial marches. And this is how the statue looks today. It's outside the Musée Guimet, the Museum of Asian Art for the Louvre in Paris. A celebrated commission for New York was the Continents to adorn the new Custom House. This is his model, which is in Chesterwood, for America and how it looked when it was erected at the Custom House, and his model for Africa, sleeping Africa, and how that looks at the Custom House. And of course, this is another controversial piece today, with some people saying that it reinforces stereotypes and should be removed. It would be hard to do because it is in perfect harmony on the right with the other terrific works outside the Custom House. It was a big commission. The Custom House produced most of the tax revenue for the United States at that point. At least the revenues flowed through the Custom House, still standing on the tip of Manhattan. So here's the successful sculptor. He sacrificed his hair, but he gained, as I say, respect, reputation, and wealth. And the one thing he had yet to do was Abraham Lincoln. And there had been calls for a national Lincoln memorial in Washington for decades. In fact, in 1865, this is an imagined, I guess, the 19th century version of Photoshop, an imagined version of Clark Mills's idea for a Lincoln memorial is kind of a wedding cake with Lincoln seated at the top and his political advisors and generals, mounted cavalry officers, and it was supposed to be built in 1865. It never was, and perhaps it was kind of a good thing. In 1887, friend and rival St. Gaudens created a masterpiece of his own, his Lincoln the Man, for Lincoln Park in Chicago, unveiled by no less than Abraham Lincoln II, the grandson, in 1887. Now, they were friends and rivals. In 1891, when William Sherman died, St. Gaudens was summoned to do a death mask. He didn't want to do it. He thought it was kind of creepy, I guess. So he brought his friend French along, and Dan French did this death mask, which later served as the model for the big equestrian statue near Central Park in New York. French did a head of his own without benefit of a mask because he got a commission from the state of Nebraska at last to do a Lincoln of his own for the state capitol. It was supposed to be for the Lincoln Centennial in 1909, but it was dedicated in 1912 with the plinth in back with the words of the Gettysburg Address designed by Henry Bacon. So their collaboration is pretty set by the second decade of the 20th century, when French becomes a member of the National Commission for the Arts, which meets in Washington. Here they are, a bunch of white men, of course, and at the chair, at the head of the table, is Daniel Chester French. And they are the ones who are assigned the idea, at long last, of creating a Lincoln Memorial in Washington. It's been 45 years since the idea was proposed, and it's finally coming together. The first challenge, where would it be sited? Well, one idea was where Union Station is now. For those of you who know Washington, you'll recognize the station, if not the isolation it once held. Well, they didn't want that because they thought commuters would rush by the memorial when they got off trains. Well, how about the base of the Capitol? Well, too legislative, they thought, and eventually a statue of Ulysses S. Grant took its place there. Another suggestion was the Soldiers' Home. The building on the left is where Lincoln spent his summers after 1862, but it was too remote, they decided. The old Naval Observatory was suggested, also rejected as too remote. Well, Lincoln's old private secretary, now the Secretary of State, John Hay, um, proposed a site, not this one, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is Meridian Park in near the Maryland border, also proposed for the memorial. But there already was a seated statue there of who? None other than James Buchanan, Lincoln's discredited predecessor. So now we go to the site that John Hay wanted. And what can one say about this site? It does not look like much. It's wet, it's soggy, it's pretty remote. And the Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, who had seen Lincoln as a young man during the Lincoln-Douglas debates back in Illinois, said he will never let a statue of his hero be built in that damn old swamp. In fact, he was so adamant about it that he threatened to order the construction of it across the river at Arlington, where the Robert E. Lee mansion stood. In fact, I don't think it's an accident that Henry Bacon's earliest design for the memorial kind of echoed the Lee mansion in Arlington. This one was a little bit too high. I don't even think young people could climb those steps. The designs were all over the place. And by the way, at this point, the damned old swamp was chosen as the site of the memorial. Here's a design by Henry Bacon, sort of a colonnaded backdrop to a standing statue. Bacon had no real competition for this job. He had the job. But John Russell Pope wanted it, and he did his best. He got the National Gallery of Art as a consolation prize, and he had a pyramid in mind in this 1912, or a kind of Mayan temple, all rejected, and ultimately Henry Bacon gets to do what he wants. There's Bacon, and as you see, he got it right. This beautiful Parthenon-like building on a reflecting pool, which is kind of exactly what it wound up to be. But in his earliest conception, he had a standing Lincoln in mind. And that's because there was a lot of pressure to save money by doing a reproduction of Augustus St. Gaudens's Chicago statue. And Dan French was not happy. He'd had enough of his days of competition and kind of rejection by St. Gaudens. And in fact, if a standing statue was needed, he could do one of his own. But he argued for a seated statue, and that is ultimately where the commission headed. No competition again for French. Bacon was always his choice as an architect. He was Bacon's choice as the sculptor. He was the most famous sculptor in America, and no one was going to deny him that opportunity. He went to work. He did prodigious research. He got a set of, now a rarity, the collected photographs of Abraham Lincoln, and he studied it. And if you look at that photograph on the bottom right of the upright page, there's a seated Lincoln that he could pay attention to. There are quite a few he could study. He ordered a copy of the life mask made of Lincoln in March 1860. And the nails were put in by French himself without cracking it, by the way. And that was because he could take measurements for enlargements. That was a sculptor's trick. He ordered the plaster casts of Lincoln's hands made in May 1860, right after he'd been nominated. He really couldn't use the right hand, which is on your left, because it had been swollen by too much handshaking when Lincoln let the plaster be smothered over his hand, and it was unusable. So French did plaster casts of his own hands. There are the hands of genius, Daniel Chester French's. Now, if he ever drew his conceptions, he did them on blackboard with chalk. So we don't have real records of how he ever arrived at his idea of the Lincoln Memorial. We just have a 12-inch high model that those of you in the museum can see on display at the Rockwell. I don't know how he did it. He just did it. And there it was, Lincoln enthroned. The only thing he played with in his subsequent enlargements were the positions of the feet. He reversed them. If you see the way the left foot is advanced here, now the right foot protrudes. This is a larger model. And as he told Henry Bacon, it was now an accomplished fact. Eventually a 6-foot high model. He kept making enlargements. This photograph made at Chesterwood. And notice he's tucked in his original model under the drapes of Lincoln's coat to show the viewer how it progressed. Well, this is the model he shipped off to be reproduced in marble by his stonecutters with the reminder that it was to be 12 or 13 feet high. The only problem is he visited the Lincoln Memorial and he realized almost at once that the atrium was going to dwarf the statue. So he petitioned the Memorial Commission to give him more money to make it 19 feet high. And they said, basically, to the most famous sculptor in America, no way. We're not paying another $25,000 for just because you whimsically decided to make it 50% higher. So at his own expense, which was unusual for this frugal Yankee, he created a plaster head of Lincoln in the proportion of a 19-foot high statue. He brought it down to the memorial. He had it suspended from the roof of the unfinished interior. And he invited members of the commission and other VIPs to look at it, suspended right where it would be if he was allowed to build it in that size. And they were convinced. They said, you're right. You've got the extra money. Go with God, make it 19 feet high. Well, he didn't go with God. He went with the Piccirilli brothers of the Bronx, New York, right near what is now Yankee Stadium. They had a studio for marble and stone cutting, and they were entrusted with cutting the marble. There you see them working with the plaster head and reproducing it in marble. A magazine artist caught their work. That's French's 6-foot model in situ. French went there often, worked on the marble as it was being reproduced. And he loved going there because Caruso records were always playing. And he loved watching the brothers hand off the chisels to each other without any pause in the work and seeing it proceed seamlessly one to another. He also managed to be there at lunchtime because one of the brothers was assigned to make pasta every day, and French enjoyed that too. Meanwhile, not in the Berkshires, not in the Bronx, but in Washington, the memorial building had been rising in that damned old swamp, slowly but inexorably rising. And here it's coming into the extraordinarily symmetrical building that we know today. And in 1919, it was brought down to Washington in 28 pieces, 21 carved, 7 for the interior, Georgia marble. It had never been assembled before. And here you see I think that's, there was 2 of the Piccirillis in the photograph, at least 2. And you see the section with Lincoln's right hand and chair are being raised by a hand pulley to sit in place right there. Eventually, French himself at the left is on site. And even though he is just about 70 years old, he goes up and down those 2 ladders. That looks a little scary to me. Remember, this is on a 10-foot base. And he scampers up. Well, he gets himself up to polish things off. He always likes to make adjustments for the light, which was pretty strong from above at the beginning. We'll talk about the lighting. And it was absolutely finished and shown to a chosen few on the 56th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, whose words were inscribed inside. November 19th, 1919. Nice symmetrical date, 1919. But not until Memorial Day, 1922, did crowds gather outside the building, not yet fully landscaped, ultimately 40 or 50,000 people for the dedication. And they got quite a show that day. They saw not one, but two American presidents, Warren Harding at left and William Howard Taft at right. Taft, he was the Chief Justice at that point. Now, Dan French is on there. I think he is in the second row right next to Harding. The man sitting just to our right of the left-hand pillar with his hand over his heart is Robert Lincoln, the son of the president who is being honored in that memorial. There was only one Black speaker on the program that day, and it was not exactly a memorial event dedicated to Lincoln's reputation as a great emancipator. This is Robert Russa Moton. He's the principal of Tuskegee Institute, which Booker Washington had founded. Yes, he gets to give the speech. He's not allowed to sit on the platform where the other speakers and dignitaries are seated. He's told, in fact, that he has to submit his text before the speech is delivered. And the official censors tell him that he can't say that Lincoln's work is unfinished, that racial equity has not been achieved, that opportunity is still lacking. He's told either take that part out of your speech or we'll get someone else. He took it out. Meanwhile, even as Confederate veterans who were in their 80s and 90s were seated in the front, the people who had occupied those seats from the early morning of dedication day, African Americans, were rousted out of the seats and forced to sit in a separate roped off area for Blacks only, that one newspaper almost jokingly called the Cour d'Afrique, segregated, separate, unequal. So it was a flawed ceremony dedicated to sectional reconciliation, not racial reconciliation. And here are the true principles of that event: President Harding, Robert Lincoln, and Speaker Joe Cannon. Still, it is a triumph artistically, a triumph in every way, including the epigram written by an art critic. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever, flanked by the words of Gettysburg and the second inaugural, but no mention made of the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, this is all about the reunification of the country. The names of the states are on the outside of the building, northern as well as southern, loyal as well as rebellious. Well, getting back to technical issues, French is not pleased with the lighting that he sees the evening of dedication day. And that's because the skylight had been covered over and a new policy had been introduced: open the doors of the memorial day and night. Great public service, but light flooded in from the front. And it looked in many days like it did at left. French got General Electric to do a study for electric lighting. I don't know how many statues were lit electrically at that time, but the Lincoln Memorial was quite successfully, quite early on. So after this, what I call a flawed dedication, I guess the Lincoln Memorial established itself as a reliable tourist attraction, as a visitor favorite, certainly as a great, great American work of art. Made in part in the Berkshires, in part in Manhattan, in part in the Bronx, but now a mainstay in the nation's capital. But it had not quite bridged the chasm between sectional and racial reconciliation. All of that changed on Easter Sunday, 1939, when this gifted singer, Marion Anderson, was invited to sing on the steps of the memorial. By chance, she was supposed to sing in Constitution Hall, but its owners, the Daughters of the American Revolution, said, "You can't. You're African American." Eleanor Roosevelt convinced the Interior Department to host her at the Lincoln Memorial instead. You can still hear her singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" and "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen" on YouTube. It's worth listening. 75,000 people, more than at the dedication, fully integrated, listened to her, and it was broadcast live on radio. Of the "We Sing," she sang that day, not of the "I Sing," "Let Freedom Ring." 1939, 17 years after the dedication, the image of the memorial changed. It was now not a fixed tribute to Lincoln, the uniter. It was an aspirational symbol of racial equity. And that continued in that same year when Frank Capra's movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, came out. Freshman Senator Jefferson Smith, Jimmy Stewart, as you see, goes to the memorial, sees the statue, hears a little boy reading the Gettysburg Address, and sees a Black man crying at the words. Left unsaid is whether he's crying in gratitude or in regret of the fact that the promise has not come true. But think of the millions who in that same year saw and heard the promise of the Lincoln Memorial being transformed. Not to mention this scene at the end of Young Mr. Lincoln from 1939. This time Henry Fonda marching off to his destiny at the end of the movie with the music of the Battle Hymn of the Republic swelling and this image coming into view. Lincoln the man morphing into Lincoln the monument. Now, the Lincoln Memorial early on became a must-see visitation place, not just for Warren Harding, but for all successor presidents. Here is Franklin Roosevelt standing in front of his car with the help of a military aide. He never made it up the steps, needless to say. He did not have the ability to walk up steps like that, but he went. In 1946, another major moment in the emergence of the Lincoln Memorial as a place of racial reckoning, as Harry Truman speaks at the convention of the NAACP on the steps, and you may see seated second from right in the front row is Franklin D. Roosevelt's widow, now the First Lady of the world, lending her support to this use of the memorial, Eleanor Roosevelt. How can we not mention August 28th, 1963, the date of the March on Washington, when the nation's great reigning civil rights leaders gathered in front of the memorial for the march that would change so many things in America. In the front row on the left, you see Whitney Young. In the center, Roy Wilkins, and then, A. Philip Randolph, and then Dr. King, and then Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. In the top row, third from the left, is a very young man who made his first major public speech that day. Some of you may recognize him. That is the great and much missed Congressman John Lewis. Well, some presidents used, and here's Dr. King, of course, speaking at the memorial. And as he said, 50 years ago, a great American in whose majestic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. This time, no one censored the orator. Well, presidents had their own reasons to go to the memorial. Richard Nixon went there in the dead of the night to meet Vietnam War protesters. I don't think he heard them, but he met them. And then beginning in the Clinton era, the Lincoln Memorial took on yet another role, and that is the site of a newly elected president's final night as president-elect on the eve of his inaugural. It became quite a tradition. Bill Clinton in 1993. George W. Bush in 2001. Barack Obama on January 19th, 2009. And Donald Trump in 2017. Not quite the fanfare, but still deeply moving in the isolation of the pandemic lockdown. Joe Biden, just last year, January 19th, 2019. Well, one more crucial role of Daniel Chester French's Berkshire-made masterpiece as an American emblem. The successor, really, of Uncle Sam in cartoons and caricatures. It all started with Bill Malden of the Chicago Sun-Times, November 1963, the Lincoln Memorial as the symbol of national mourning over the death of John F. Kennedy. Jeff Dancy of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the inauguration of Barack Obama. Fourscore and 7 years ago, this was unfathomable, Mr. President, and a fist bump to bring him into the modern era. Or David Horsey of the Los Angeles Times commenting on the inauguration of Donald Trump. And comment on the debates, the Trump-Biden debates of 2020. This time Lincoln is holding a remote. I love that. Clicking off. And the inauguration of Joe Biden after the January 6th demonstrations. Lincoln's message in brief in 2020. What could be a more powerful statement than the T-shirt? And think of it, this is what the way Lincoln was perceived on the National Mall in cartoons in his own time. The author of the Emancipation Proclamation, not as a heroic figure who thought Black Lives mattered, but as someone who unmasked, revealed himself as Satan. And isn't it interesting? He's standing on the National Mall because that's the unfinished Washington Monument behind him. But Lincoln stood tall, not as the devil, but as an American symbol of justice. Here he is, of course, in Norman Rockwell's great Lincoln for the Defense, which is in the show that you're seeing today, and I hope we'll see again and again. Now, keep in mind that Lincoln statues around the country are under threat. Rockwell's Lincoln may stand tall, but this standing Lincoln statue in Portland, Oregon, was brought down in 2020 by those who protested Lincoln's condoning the execution of 38 Dakota Indians in 1862 after an uprising that resulted in hundreds of fatalities. Left unspoken is the fact that he pardoned 265 Native Americans. Now, during the Black Lives Matter movement, this photograph circulated through the internet. Lincoln's skull fractured, graffiti and slogans scrawled on his face and torso and on the wall. Well, the memorial, in fact, had been cordoned off with fencing. This was a photoshopped protest. It's still chilling. Let's all remember, this is the Lincoln Memorial of our aspirations, the one Norman Rockwell envisioned, ever standing. Another one that I find rather charming, because I'm lucky enough to own it, is this vision of Lincoln with the American flag, the Lincoln of the Lincoln Memorial, and it's by a painter who you may know for some of his other artistic pursuits. You might see his name on the bottom right of the canvas, Benedetto, but that's his non-stage name. He's, of course, Tony Bennett, and he painted this in 2000. This is Barack Obama's favorite photograph. of his election night in 2008. It's not his friends and family gathered in Chicago. It's young people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, listening to their iPhones and radios for the news of the choice in that election. And we end in a way with Daniel Chester French, a wonderful painting of him. Most of the photographs and paintings that he allowed himself to sit for in old age made certain that the Lincoln Memorial model that he took back to Chesterwood, took back to the heaven of the Berkshires, was always up front no matter what he was working on. Late in his life, he visited one final time. And here is a picture of French at around age 80 in front of his greatest triumph, the Lincoln Memorial. He ruminated that he would like to come back in 1,000 years and see what the statue and the memorial looked like. But I think in this age of iconoclasm, when so many statues, not just Confederate statues, which in my view should be removed from public squares, but as I said, statues of Lincoln, statues of Theodore Roosevelt are being questioned and in fact hauled away. We don't know what the future of any sculptural work dedicated to American heroes may be. We don't know if it will last 1,000 years. But as we look at Bob Stocky's illustration for the New Yorker of sort of a illuminated O for Obama rising over the memorial on that night of his election, November 2008, I want to finish with a story about a young hotel porter who visited the Lincoln Memorial one night and was moved to write down his observations in verse. We shouldn't be surprised at that because his name was Langston Hughes. And it was right before he went off to college and became a great American poet. This is what he wrote in 1926. Let's go see old Abe, sitting lonely in the marble and the moonlight. Quiet for 10,000 years, old Abe. Quiet for a million years. Quiet and yet a voice forever against the timeless walls of time. Old Abe, built in the Berkshires, enshrined in Washington, and in the American consciousness. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Harold. That was quite an epic period of time and a lot of history there. So we have a number of questions that I'd like to share with folks. One question from your earliest photo of him wearing what we might call a dress today. Can you talk a little bit about why the photograph might have been set up that way?
Well, first of all, that's the outfit that proper young children of the age wore if they had some wealth and status and didn't have to, work on the farm during errands. Actually, Dan did work on a farm in Concord, but he was obviously trotted out in the late 19th century family best. We have a photo of Franklin Roosevelt in a quote, kind of a dress as well. But the hair is the best. I mean, the ringlets are terrific. So it's just, that's your fancy dress for church and the photographers. Obviously, when they cut the hair, they got their first trousers and life went on.
Thank you. Here's another question. Some artists have been known to hire other artists that specialize in animals to cover those needs. Did Daniel Chester French actually sculpt his horses along with his human figures?
He did not. That's a great question. And I thought I would avoid it by showing only one equestrian. No, I showed two. I showed, well, three, Hooker, Grant, and of course, George Washington. No, he had a sculptor with whom he worked. I'm blanking out on his name, but I am going to post it on my website so everybody can know that I diligently pursued it. And he did all of the horses for French. He met him in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition, and they interacted and collaborated then. And French didn't just, I don't know whether he was unable to do the horses. He didn't like it much, and he just didn't like wasting his time with it. So, and he was perfectly happy to have this collaboration.
Thank you. Another question. You showed a photograph of the collected photographs of Lincoln that is a very rare object now in collections. Can you share more generally some of the other primary sources that you access to write your book and to do all of the research for this talk?
Oh, sure. To write the book, I had access to the collected papers of Daniel Chester French that were passed on to his daughter, Peggy, and later housed at Chesterwood before they were put at Williams College Library for safekeeping. So I had access to all of that material, plus the copies that are helpfully contained, that are kept in the Chesterwood offices. I was able to spend a week in residence at French's studio, not the one where all the sculptures are, but the one across the street that's run by the Red Lion Inn. French built for some more privacy and more light late in his life. There are also French papers at the Library of Congress, and my wife and I did quite a bit of research there in the original papers. I mean, there is no better resource than Chesterwood itself, because you can't imagine the work or the art or the artist without seeing the sculptures themselves and the models and the copies that are kept at Chesterwood in the old barn gallery, now beautifully designed by my old Metropolitan Museum colleague Jeff Daly, are just fabulous. And you just take inspiration from the results of his inspiration. That combined with visits to the cemetery in Concord, the statues in Boston, the going back to DuPont Circle in Washington to remind oneself that he could not only do realistic portraiture, but beautiful symbolic work as well. Saratoga, Brooklyn, all the places where French's statues still stand. So a combination of documentary and art resource, I would say.
Thank you. Can you describe for folks who haven't had the opportunity to visit Chesterwood what the main studio feels like when you're in it today, and maybe a little bit more about the studio across the road?
Okay, the studio to me has two aspects to it. It has a workroom that looks as if Dan French has just left it or is just about to return to it. The tools are there. The potter's wheel is there. The old wooden table is there, where he actually worked with the implements that he used, ingeniously arranged and kept. It's kind of rustic, as a workroom would be. And then you go out into the bigger space with a very high ceiling, with a trap door. And you can't imagine what it is until you're told or in advance. French kept the larger work on this space, and when he wanted to see how his work would look outdoors, they would open the huge doors of the studio and wheel it out on a kind of a railroad flatbed so that he could examine it in the light and also scamper down the hill so that he could view it from the perspective it might be seen from someone standing at the bottom of a pedestal. So you get the feeling of an ingenious craftsman at work. But then if you back up to the other door, you see a kind of an extraordinarily original, eclectic, almost kooky visitor reception area with a Roman bed, artwork, elaborate curtains, beautiful garden outside with stone benches designed by French himself and some of his friends. So I think you go in that studio and you have the sense of a master showman and a master craftsman. That's what I get from the studio. And besides all of that, you have the spectacular gardens. And French, it's not just for decoration. French was an avid gardener. There was almost as much correspondence about art as there was in his collection, as there was correspondence with seed catalog owners and transporting of flowers and replanting. He loved his gardens and he tended them almost every day of the season he spent there. The studio across the way is interesting as well. It's much more residential now than it was in French's day, but I can see why he wanted it. Aside from the fact that he used nude models, so it was probably better to be across the way. I don't think he behaved inappropriately. In fact, when one of his models wrote a memoir, she gave him a copy. French was kind of surprised, and she said to him, "Aren't you glad now that you behaved so well?" So I think he was did not take advantage of the situation, and professionals don't. But what I was struck by at the studio was the outdoor part of this studio has a far more severe drop in altitude, because French still always wanted the low perspective that you would use to see the Lincoln Memorial, for example. He didn't have 12 feet to build a pedestal or 19 feet to see the top of his statues, but he could go lower to take a look. And obviously, statues are carved rather more dramatically, almost in a caricatured way if you're up close. And it takes just that extra artistic genius to know how to do that so that it will look proportionate when you're facing it from as a visitor. I don't know how they did that. Just parenthetically, before you get to another question, I know people often say, as they did in the case of the Robert E. Lee statue that was taken down in Richmond, which is actually pretty good, probably the best of the works of art that has been removed. People said, well, just put it in a museum, so it can be put in context. Of course, it can be put in context through captions and screens, but you can never reproduce the height. So the Mercier statue brought down to eye level will look like a cartoon. And people will say, what was all the shouting about? So it's almost better not, the shouting of appreciation for it as a work of art. So it took a very special gift to be able to envision statues like Washington or Hooker or the Lincoln Memorial in such an elevated position. And remember, French wanted people, the reason he didn't want a standing statue, I know I'm answering questions that have yet to be asked, but one reason he didn't want a standing statue, aside from potentially odious comparisons to St. Gaudens, is that he wanted the top of it to be seen by everyone who started at the bottom step all the way up. No part of it should be above your level of vision. So he had to create a portrait that made sense from the lowest step and from the atrium. Since I have no clue how artists do anything, I just stand back in awe. I don't know how he did it.
Yeah, thank you. So many layers of perspective in what you just shared. Our final question for today is really a two-part question. One of our participants is asking for you to comment on his work from an artistic point of view. What techniques did he use to invent such a lifelike presence or to attain such spiritual idealism? So that's the first part of it. And the second part, our attendee suggests that in their minds, the only other artist they think who's evoked such grandeur in space is Olmsted, and asks, did they know each other?
Wow, that's a great question. I think Olmsted was was 28 years younger. They probably knew each other a bit. I'm just trying to think of Olmsted's death date. If French was a member of the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which of course was located in Olmsted Central Park at that point. They were both members of the Century Club, but I'm not sure about their intersection. But certainly they, quote, ran in the same circles, not to be vulgar about it, but century clubs, artistic societies, and the Metropolitan. And it's possible. It's certainly possible.
Olmsted died in 1903.
Then it's more than possible. It's likely. I am going to ask my friends I call them the FLO contingent. That's the Frederick Law Olmsted. Actually, for anybody who asked a question that I failed to answer, you should email me at haroldholzer@haroldholzer.com, and I will get answers to you. But since I'm also speaking this month twice on Olmsted, because it's his bicentennial this year, that is an interesting question too. Once I'm doing it at the Century Club, to which they both belong. Now, I'm not going to do much better with technique, because it's just a mystery to me. How did French get everything to cohere? Why did he know that he should choose marble and not bronze, as people suggested he do for the Lincoln Memorial? How did he create realistic portraiture in such enlarged fashion from such a deep perspective? I mean, I guess if I knew, I could do it, maybe. I don't know. But I think French was unique among the sculptors of the period because he could do realism and he could do symbolism, and he could, he was just fantastic at both. I don't think you could say that about St. Gaudens or Borglum or any of his contemporaries. And part of that, and he was a specialist, particularly in angels. In fact, he was friends in his youth with the great ornithologist of his age. And whenever he had a new angel commission, he would ask him to send him some birds through the mail. I wouldn't want to open the package, but he did. And he was majestic at it. Look at Morning Victory, the draped figure in the cemetery in Concord, or the Angel of Death juxtaposed with a real human figure. That's tricky. So he combined techniques, naturalism and symbolism, romanticism and realism. And again, if other artists knew the clue, then they would have been able to do it as well. I was happy just to be able to learn about his life. And by the way, a man of very few words when it comes to his sculpture. And it's kind of maddening. What did he say about the Lincoln Memorial? He was besieged by reporters. Tell us what you meant to say. And he sort of thought about it and said 4 words: work over, victory his. And that was the extent of his explanation. He said, people are entitled to see anything that they want, not what I wanted in my work. And that's what I've tried to do.
Yep. Thank you so much, Harold, for this wonderful, enlightening presentation. Thank you for your generosity in lending us some of your objects for the exhibition that, again, Lincoln Memorial Illustrated on view here at the Norman Rockwell Museum through September 4th. And please, everyone, visit our collaborating organization, Chesterwood, that has all sorts of special events planned, including over Memorial Day weekend, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Lincoln Memorial. So thank you all for joining us. And Harold, a special thanks to you.
Thank you, Sue. Hope to see you soon when I come up.